Erev Tov, good evening. We are We're continuing our study of Rabbi Shem Tov Gagin's introduction to the third volume of his Keter Shem Tov, The Shattered Wall of Israel. We're taking apart episode by episode of infighting and separation in the Jewish community. Today's shiur was dedicated to the speedy recovery of my uncle, Yitzchak Daniel ben Batya Ilana. Yisrael refuah shlema b'zat Hashem b'toch Shaar Cholei Israel. Refuat hanefesh, refuat haguf, el na refana lo, b'zat Hashem yitbarach. He should have a complete recovery, return home to his wife who's with us here, and to his Kehillat. We are waiting for him, b'zat Hashem, and to the rest of his family and friends. The next episode we're discussing is a discussion around the tzedukim, Tzadokim, a number of different pronunciations, otherwise known in English as the Sadducees. Before I share anything that I'm going to share today, we have to share some historical background. And that's important. It says in the Torah, Zichru yemot olam binu shenot dor vador. You must remember the days of old. You have to ponder, binu. It's not just enough to remember, also to think about it, to analyze it. The commentaries on the pasuk there share that we must learn lessons for the future from mistakes of the past. If things happen to Am Yisrael, then we have an obligation not just to remember history for the sake of history, but to remember history for the sake of the present and definitely for the future. And that's exactly what we do here in this shiurim. We're discussing these topics because every episode that happened to Am Yisrael in our history of division and infighting has relevance to similar parallel issues that are going on in the Jewish community today. As we discussed in the past on page, I believe it's 8 or 9 in your PDF, but it's the Roman numeral 11. So there's a PDF, it says Rabbi Shem Tov Gagin, Keter Shem Tov, 1-30. So you want to be in that PDF, it's attached to the Zoom invitation, it's also attached to the winter materials in any Google Classroom's classwork section. So the first episode we discussed was Mamlechet Yisrael Nifrada Yehuda, the separation of the kingdom of Israel, the kingdom of Yehuda. We then spent last week discussing much about the Samaritans, the Shomronim, and their struggles with the Jewish community. We touched on, right before we finished, on a group known as the Essenes. The Essenes, who were a pious group of individuals, we discussed them in the writings of Philo and Josephus. And today this brings us to the Tzedokim, however you wish to say the word. In letter Daled on Roman numeral 11. HaTzedukim HaRishonim bimei habayit hasheni. The early Tzedukim. Now, why we say early Tzedukim? Because there are going to be groups later in history, we're going to discuss them. For example, the Karaim, the Karaites, who bear resemblance to the Tzedukim, but they are not Tzedukim. So Tzedukim are their own group of people, whereas Karaim are also their own independent group of people. And they are separated by many, many, many years and many other episodes in history, and we'll get to them in time. But the early Tzedukim, Bimei habayit hasheni, in the times of the second Bet Midrash, Nifredu mehapurushim. They separated themselves from the Purushim. Who are the Purushim? What do we call them in English?
Us.
Yeah, that's us, but what do you call them? You've heard the word before, you just probably have no idea who. Pharisees, very good. We are Pharisees. But the Pharisees, that term pretty much disappeared in use. Why? The Jewish people have no use for the word, because pretty much after Bayit Sheni, the destruction of the second temple, which we'll discuss, pretty much after Bayit Sheni, the groups that were surrounding the Pharisees, the Perushim, the Tzedukim, the Essenes, all of these groups pretty much fell by the wayside. They disappeared, and there's theories as to why that happened, when it happened. I'm going to discuss that soon. But ultimately, the word Perushim is maintained really only in one culture, and that's in where? Where do you find the word Pharisees very often? There's one breakaway sect that began in the times of the second Bet Mikdash. The Christians, very good. All over the New Testament. And by the way, if you want to see some pretty vile things about Jewish people, just run a search in the New Testament with the word Pharisees. you're too curious, so just check out Matthew 23 or something like that. You'll see some wonderful things. Scribes and Pharisees, all kinds of delightful teachings that, of course, did not contribute to anti-Semitism throughout Jewish history. And so we don't use the word Pirushim, pretty much because we are Pirushim, and we were the only Jews left. By the way, there's a similar history, if I can draw a parallel. Many of you are familiar, perhaps, with Chabad Lubavitch. It's a Jewish movement and subcategory. I see some of you saying no. Of course you are. And Chabad Lubavitch is really synonymous. Chabad and Lubavitch are the same thing. Chabad being an ideology surrounding the first Lubavitcher Rebbe of blessed memory, Shneur Zalman of Liadi, and Lubavitch being an actual geographic location. It's a city. I don't even know if it's a city, a village, a town. I don't know exactly what it was. I wasn't there. And you sometimes wonder why Chabad Lubavitch as opposed to what? And the truth is that in the history of Chabad Chassidut, there are many breakaways. Are you not hearing me well? Lilinaz?
I do quite well.
Okay, so then...
I can hear you.
No, Sarah, if you want to disconnect and join, that might solve the problem.
Okay, I'll try that in a minute with my laptop.
No problem, perfect. So there were many breakaways from the Chabad Hasidic sect. So for example, the most famous of them is perhaps the first Lubavitcher Rebbe student, who felt that the son who succeeded the first Lubavitcher Rebbe was not authentic to his father's teachings, or was simply not well versed enough to continue his father's legacy. And that created a split. And you have other Chabad groups like Kapust and others that pretty much are wiped out in the Holocaust. So we don't have any descendants of theirs, at least not theologically. And Chabad Lubavitch was the only surviving branch of the Chabad Chassidut. And so it's very convenient today, post the Holocaust, to claim, Chabad is a movement, and there were 7 Rebbes, and these are the 7 Rebbes, and they started here, and they end here. But really, it's not accurate. It's simply the history being told by those who survived, as opposed to the history being told by those who didn't. And the same thing seemingly happens to Am Yisrael, which is we're broken up in the times of the second Bet Midrash between Pharisees, Pirushim, and Tzedukим, and Baitusim, and early Christians, and all kinds of other groups. And we are the ones who survived to tell the story. So it's obvious that our story is told with a bias towards ourselves. Let's just be aware of that. That we are telling the story as if we are the Jewish people, and these are all groups that broke away from us. And we discussed last week that the Shomonim, for example, the Samaritans would beg to differ. Nifredu mehapurushim. So they separated themselves from the Pharisees. Now the Tzedukim will swear to you that it's the other way around. They didn't separate themselves from anybody. It's the Pharisees who invented a rabbinic law that separated themselves from the rest of the Jewish people. But this is our history being told through our lens. V'kafru b'tchiyat hametim. One of the hallmarks of the Tzedukim, which we'll discuss in depth soon, is that they didn't believe in the revival of the dead, the world to come, Mashiach, similar ideas, and that's a very integral part of their faith. Uvigmul ve'onesh, and they don't believe either in reward and consequences. And this sentence of Gmul and Onesh is going to bring about with it an entire conversation surrounding who founded the Tzedukim, where did they come from, who was the rabbi, why are they important. And I really, if I could tell you, that all of the sects that we spoke about until now, especially the Essenes and the Sadducees, they are guilty of only one thing. And they're guilty of creating Pirushim. They're guilty of creating, if I could borrow for a lack of a better word, they're guilty of creating Orthodox Judaism the way you and I see it today. And I left you off with that note last week. And I told you that today, through the lens of this conversation, we're going to discuss some major problems that face the Jewish community today, especially the variety that is known as Orthodox. And all of it can be traced back to this tragic episode in history, which is Rabbi Shem Tov Gagin's 4th example of separation in infighting in the Jewish people. So I mentioned to you the Tzedukim. I mentioned to you that they were a movement that starts around the times of the second Bet Mikdash. I mentioned to you that some of their main tenets of their faith are that they don't believe in the next world, they don't believe in reward and consequences, they don't believe in Kehillat, the revival of the dead, and other concepts which are unique to Perushi or Pharisee rabbinic Judaism. Now those terms, Pharisees and rabbinic Judaism, if you want it to be correct, you can actually split those into further categories. There's the Perushim and then there's rabbinic Judaism that comes out of there, but for the sake of today's conversation, I'm going to use Perushim and rabbinic Jews as the same thing. The Tzedukim belong to the group of Kohanim. So if you've been following my Rambam's Mishnah Torah class, we're right now discussing the founding of the Anshe Knesset HaGedolah, the men of the Great Assembly, who are the Chachamim, spearheaded by Ezra. Ezra HaSofer, who's a Kohen. Ezra overthrows his brethren, the Kohanim, because he views them to be part of a corrupt Jewish leadership, and replaces the Kohanim as teachers of the Torah with the Chachamim who carry on the baton of the Torah. This is an internal revolution that affects almost everything we do in Judaism today. For those who are not familiar with that Rambam class, if you just want episodes 39, 40, 41, and last night's 42, are discussing this entire topic at great length. Why do we find so many separations in this period of Jewish history? So we've had infighting before, but something seems to happen around this period in which the Jewish people blow into pieces. We start fragmenting up, and by the way, every one of these denominations have their own subcategories. So Tzedukim possibly have their own subcategories of Tzedukim. The same with Perushim. We're going to discuss next week that the Perushim have their own breakaway groups. You may be familiar with them. They're who the rabbis blame as responsible for the destruction of Jerusalem. They're a group of zealous Pharisees. And they decide to revolt and to make problems, and ultimately that's what our rabbis blame, the destruction of the Bet Midrash. So what happened? What happened that led to all of this infighting? There are a number of different scholarly opinions, but I'll share just a few of them. The first, I think, is important to understand that all of this is happening right after Judaism interacts strongly with Greek culture. So this is the period of Hellenism. This is the story of Chanukah. So Chanukah wreaks its havoc. Yes, we build a Bet Midrash. Yes, we overthrow the enemy foreign forces. Yes, all of that happens. But there are side effects, multi-generational traumas, if you wish to call them, that lead to major problems in Am Yisrael. The first and foremost being the exposure of the Jewish people to foreign ideologies. And Jews like to try to get their foreign ideologies to mix in with their natural ideologies. And ultimately you have Jews that are exploring other avenues of thought, of philosophy, ways of life. And now the Jewish community has to struggle with that. The Jewish community is trying to put together, so what do we believe? We're not Jewish anymore, we're Jewish and this becomes a major crisis, and different Jewish groups deal with that in different ways. I think after the destruction of, in this time period of the second Bet Mikdash, you have a rebellion. This rebellion that pretty much saves the Jewish people leads to a certain revolution. Kind of like if you're familiar with Israeli history, what happens after the 6-Day War and the success of the 6-Day War. All kinds of religious movements start to break out in Israel. A messianic fervor starts to take over the country. Many of the things that we hear today in what they call the Kiruv world and the ills of that community can be directly traced back to the euphoria that happens after the 6-Day War. There also is one more major factor, and that is who is in charge of the Jewish people is very much dictated by who controls which region of the state of Israel. What is the capital of the Jewish people? Okay, I'm glad we got that answer. Yerushalayim is the capital of the Jewish people. Very good. And which part of Yerushalayim is the most important part of Yerushalayim, not just religiously, but also politically for the Jewish people? Very good, the Temple Mount, the Bet Mikdash. The Temple Mount is crucial. If we discussed last week the Samaritans, the Shomronim, trying to get the temple destroyed, that's part of a play to control the destiny of the Jewish people, or at least be in charge, be a major player on the board of the Jewish people. When you find other episodes that are connected to the Bet HaMikdash, you see that people are in a power struggle. Who controls the Bet HaMikdash dictates who leads the Jewish people. And by the way, ultimately for the Samaritans, it didn't work out well because they had their Bet HaMikdash, their temple in Har Gerizim destroyed after that unfortunate episode. And so here you have other groups of Jews that are fighting primarily because they want political power. They want to control the Jewish community. And here it's important to jump into the writings of Josephus. Josephus, who lives in this time period. Josephus shares with us the numbers. So what number of Jews are we talking about? The percentages of populations. According to Josephus, in that first century, there were Tziddukim, but only a handful of them. Some numbers say maybe a couple hundred. Not very many, a few hundred Tziddukim. Compare that to the Essenes, which we spoke about last week. The Essenes are about a population of 4,000. The Pirushim, who are the Pharisees, they're around 6,000 members. And then may or may not include that fourth category that I mentioned to you earlier of the Zealots. Those Zealots have many names. Zealots, there's a word for it in Latin, but the Sikrikim, the Sakurai, maybe they call them. You have the Kanai, a few different names that this group is referred to, but a subcategory of the Pharisees. Some call it the Philosophia Haravi'it, the fourth philosophy that was in the Jewish people. And there may have been other little categories, but these were the major breakdowns. So the Tziddukim were in the minority. So how did the Tziddukim become so influential? The answer is quite simple. They were Kohanim. The Tziddukim were Kohanim. The Tziddukim were not just Kohanim, but they are descended from the Kohen Gadol in Jerusalem. And for this period in Jewish history, the Kohen Gadol is almost exclusively chosen from the family of Tziddukim. And because of this, the Tziddukim, though they are small in number, are very great in influence. And more than they're great in influence, if you are Kohanim and you are in charge of the Bet HaMikdash, you have a steady flow of what coming to the Bet HaMikdash? Money makes the world go round. The Tziddukim are Kohanim. Everyone has to bring offerings to the Bet HaMikdash. Everybody has to donate in the Bet HaMikdash. Everybody does something in the Bet HaMikdash. They're saying in Hebrew, Bal HaMe'ah hu Bal HaDe'ah. The one who has the money is the one who decides everything. The Tziddukim are a tremendously powerful group of people, not because of their numbers, but because of their money, their influence, and the fact that they control the Bet HaMikdash. This makes them tremendous allies for the occupying forces who are in Israel at this time, because the Tziddukim are the ruling class, and because of that, they get along very well with the government in order to preserve their autonomous power over the Jewish people. Like the Essenes, after the second Bet HaMikdash, the group of Tziddukim pretty much disappear from the face of history. So we don't really have Tziddukim surviving the Bet HaMikdash. I'm not talking biologically as much as theologically or philosophically. And the reason seems to be quite simple. Why would it be that after the destruction of the Bet HaMikdash, the Tziddukim disappear? Very good. Their headquarters fell apart. They don't have a way to collect money anymore. Really, their entire lifestyle revolves around the Bet HaMikdash. Now there is no Bet HaMikdash. What do they have left? This is a moment when Christians begin to talk to you about the blood of Yeshu because you don't have a Bet HaMikdash anymore. The rabbis were already preparing for this in the times of Islam. The rabbis were already decentralizing Judaism away from the Bet HaMikdash. They were moving people away from the Bet HaMikdash to keep them away from the corruption of the Kohanim, but also to ensure that in the event where the Bet HaMikdash gets pulled again, and that's ultimately what happens, the Jewish people have what to live on, they have what to rely on, they have what to do. And ultimately, it's the rabbi's ability to adapt. It's adaptability, really. Their ability to adapt is what ultimately saves the Pirushim and causes them to be the branch of Judaism that survives this entire episode. I think if there's lesson number one we have to walk away with, that is that unlike the stereotype today of rabbis in their very essence, the original Pharisees were capable of all kinds of adaptability. And so they weren't stubborn, they definitely weren't unorthodox. They did all kinds of unorthodox things in order to ensure the continuity of the Jewish people and the Torah of the Jewish people. Something that their counterparts in other sects of Judaism were unable to do. Because when you have a really rigid branch and you twist it, it's going to snap, it's going to break. A blade of grass lasts a little bit longer. Yes.
If I can just say one thing.
Please.
It's also, I'm trying to look it up now in Tanakh, but I believe that when Shlomo Melech is giving the inauguration of the Beit HaMikdash, he says there's going to be a time when this place won't be here. And you won't have this place for many days. I can't remember exactly where in Tanakh it is. So this is not an accident.
Very good. By the way, this is
something that
you're correct. This is not an innovation of Chachmei Israel, but the execution phase is that of Chachmei Israel. They took the initiative to actually make those changes that needed to be done in order to protect the Jewish people from what was bound to happen, unfortunately. You're correct, brother. This is something we planned for. Unfortunately, ever since we had a Beit HaMikdash, we already knew it was going to be destroyed. The Tziddukim didn't really leave behind any writings of their own, so whatever we have about the Tziddukim, we've gleaned from other people that were surrounding them, and let's be honest that we're painting a picture of the Tziddukim from those who didn't really appreciate the Tziddukim. Josephus, if I mentioned him earlier, Josephus mentions some pretty nasty things about the Tziddukim. He writes, V'yesh od kat shniya la'isim. There's another group, second to the Essenes. And he mentions they're not that different from the rest of the Jews who are in Israel at the time, except in one way. Do you remember how he described the Essenes? Their demeanor, their overall attitude towards other people? How did he describe them?
They seclude themselves. They were very extreme.
They were secluded, but he mentions
Outside influence.
he mentions something positive about them and their interpersonal relationships. Do you remember from last week?
Monastic?
Yeah, that's again part of their lifestyle. Maybe I'll clarify. They were very kind people. They were pious people to each other. They didn't run after money. They weren't hoarding things to themselves. They were taking care of other people. We mentioned this about these scenes. Josephus writes the exact opposite about the Tziddukim. But Tziddukim, kashim gam la'achehem. The Tziddukim are difficult even to their brethren. Umekablim et pnei chavrehem bechas. And they greet people with a scowl. That's the face, an angry face. They're always walking around angry. Ki'ilu hayu nochrim lehem. And they treat their fellow Jews as if they are a foreign people from them. Yesterday I was on the news and I saw one of the leaders of the fanatical element in Jerusalem being interviewed by one of the Israeli TV show hosts. And this Israeli TV show host looks at this guy, calls himself a rabbi. He tells him, you're my brother. I don't want the fighting that we have here. And what does he tell him? He looks straight in the face and he says, please don't say that again. He says, please don't say what again? He says, please don't call yourself my brother. I want to have nothing to do with you, and I want you to have nothing to do with me. Just leave us alone. And that's a powerful statement. By the way, at least he's honest. He's honest that he doesn't want anything to do with anybody. But here the Tziddukim are accused by Josephus of not being so kind. Ultimately, the conversation surrounding the Tziddukim brings us to the writings of Chachmei Israel. And what do the Chachmei Israel think about the Tziddukim? We'll discuss in just a moment. In the New Testament, you'll find many mentions of the Tziddukim. There's even debates between Yeshu and the Tziddukim. There's also debates there between the Tziddukim and the Pirushim. Yeshu is not a stranger to controversy nor to politics, and there's a famous scene in the New Testament, historic or not, accurate or not, in which he goes to the Beit HaMikdash and he whips people and overthrows tables. If you're familiar with the New Testament, you'll understand what I'm speaking about. And he makes chaos over there, accusing them of caring only about money and everything else. But also Yeshua's coming to show his power over the Temple Mount. This is again part of the power play that is going on in Jerusalem at that time. And the Tziddukim, who are these elite, removed, wealthy leaders of the Jewish community, are meeting their fate ultimately at the hands of the Pharisees, who we'll discuss B'ezrat Hashem next week. For right now, I wanted to mention a few differences between the Rabbanim and the Tzedukim. So the first and the most famous difference between the Tzedukim and the Perushim is that they don't believe in the oral law. That led to a very deep argument surrounding Sefirat HaOmer. Does anybody remember what I'm referring to? Yeah?
It's whether you start counting the Omer on the first day or on the second day.
So, Kimat. The Torah says that we count the Omer mimachorat HaShabbat, from the day after the Shabbat. Our rabbis have in tradition from Moshe Rabbeinu that mimachorat HaShabbat means the day after the first day of Pesach. So Pesach is on a Monday, so Tuesday will be the first day of the Omer. The Tzedukim, who are in control of the Bet Mikdash, they understand mimachorat HaShabbat literally from the day after Shabbat. Why? Because according to them, Shavuot, which is at the end of the 7 weeks from when you start counting Sefirat Omer, must fall out on a Sunday. Mimachorat HaShabbat, and because of that, they don't count after the first day of Pesach, they count after that first Sunday after Shabbat. One of the major arguments between the Chachamim, you might think it's not such a big deal, has a lot to do with agriculture and other things that are going on in the Bet Mikdash and freeing crops and everything else that might happen there. There's other conversations about the Kohen Gadol and what he used to do on Yom Kippurim, and pretty much every detail that has to do with rabbinic law versus what you might see as just a strict tzedukי, literal understanding of the Torah. They don't believe in many of the rabbinic inventions such as Eruvim, Eruv Chatzerot. There's a famous scene, I think it's Masechet Sukkah, for sure it's Masechet Sukkah, I think this is the scene that I'm thinking of, in which the rabbis are coming to the Bet Mikdash and they had left their lulavim and etrogim inside of the Bet Mikdash. They wouldn't have to bring them outside on Shabbat. And what happened is that they're met on the way up to the Bet Mikdash with the tzedukim pelting them with etrogim. Essentially, they stone them with etrogim. And these relations are pretty terrible. There's a very famous dispute among the tzedukim and the chachamim. The chachamim believe that we have a mitzvah of nisuch hamayim, of the water offering. The water offering in the Bet Mikdash, which we offer on which holiday? Sukkot. The whole Simchat Bet HaShoeva, the celebration in the Bet Mikdash of going to the well springs and bringing water to the Bet Mikdash. The Tzedukim didn't believe in this at all. What kind of a thing is it to offer water to HaKadosh Baruch Hu? And this is why, in the eyes of the Perushim, that whole celebration of Simchat Bet HaShoeva has so much importance. This is the Chachamim conquering the Bet Mikdash from those who don't allow them to be there. And this leads to, what's the most famous Jewish song perhaps surrounding this episode? It's a very famous Ashkenazi tune. Ushavtem ma'im besason mimaynei Yeshua ma'im. What is everything about water for? Now, for sure this was appropriated by the early Zionist movement in terms of agriculture, but this song is a victory song of the rabbis over the Tzedukim, in which they're celebrating the offering of the water in the Bet Mikdash. Now that I've shared what I've shared, let's together look at the source sheet that I handed out to you. Some order. The source sheet says Sadducees on top, so it's attached to the Google Classroom or to the Zoom invitation, whichever you're going to find it. Much of this part of the shiur I took from the writings of Rabbi Dr. Binyamin Lau. I'm not a student of his, nor do I belong to that Bet Midrash at all, but there are some pretty wise and brilliant things that he shares in his books, Our Sages. And I highly recommend them for those who wish to understand better this entire time period in Jewish history. So we're in Pirkei Avot, and source 1 on page 1. It's the third Mishnah in Pirkei Avot. This is the beginning of the teachings of our rabbis that are collected in this work, in this Mishnah of Pirkei Avot. Antignos ish Socho kibel mishimon hatzadik. Antignos from Socho is a place, Minastam, receives in tradition from Shimon HaTzadik, Shimon the righteous. Shimon HaTzadik, if you recall, let's put it in somewhere in history, Shimon HaTzadik is the one who saves the Bet Mikdash from the Samaritans last week. Remember with Alexander the Great and the rabbi he sees in the dream? That's Shimon HaTzadik. So this is the next student after that. Hu haya omer, he used to say, Al tiyu chavadim hamishamshin et harav al manat lekabel peras. Don't be like servants who serve their master in order to receive a reward. Rather, you should be like servants who serve your master, HaKadosh Baruch Hu, who don't want to see a reward at all. Vihi mora shamayim alechem, let the fear of heaven be upon you. Now you should know that this theology that Antignos Ishtocha introduces to the Jewish community is met with a tremendous amount of controversy, not just in his time, but generations afterwards. And it's beyond the scope of today's shiur to deal with this rewardless service of HaKadosh Baruch Hu. But it's very crucial to understand this teaching because he essentially gives birth to the tzeddukim and the sects that come out of that. And in order to understand that, we must understand this Mishnah a little bit better. What does it mean to serve HaKadosh Baruch Hu, not to receive a reward? So why else should I serve HaKadosh Baruch Hu? What other reason is there to serve HaKadosh Baruch Hu?
A love.
A love for HaKadosh Baruch Hu, very good. There's a certain kind of love. What else?
Though if you look at the end of his sentence, he says, Vihi mora shamayim. So he actually doesn't say love, he talks about fear.
Yeah.
Which is interesting.
Very good. But that,
A sense of duty, maybe?
a sense of
Duty.
duty. So when a child, they ask you for something and you give it to them, you normally demand that they say, thank you. Say thank you. Say please. Why say thank you? What do you care if they don't say thank you?
Because you're teaching them the right way.
They will take it for granted.
The right way is that I am an arrogant person who needs you to say thank you.
No, you're teaching them to show gratitude.
But I'm helping my child. I want to do this good thing.
You do it for his will, no?
What?
You do it because it's his will.
That's right. That's right. So then why do I need a thank you?
Because you teach him midos. Because that's his will.
Well, that's exactly. See, Antignos Ishtocha is essentially telling you, serve HaKadosh Baruch Hu even if he doesn't say thank you. There's a certain level of service of the Creator that is not petty. It doesn't revolve around, if I do this, then I'll get that. And if I don't do this, I'll get that. To stop serving HaKadosh Baruch Hu in such a juvenile fashion. To serve HaKadosh Baruch Hu because you know that the best thing for you to do is to serve HaKadosh Baruch Hu, even if it means that you won't get anything from it. There's a famous story about the Baal Shem Tov. And by the way, this story is appropriated both by the Hasidim and the Mitnagdim. I'll tell you both versions of it, and they're too similar to have been a mistake, which normally tells me the story probably didn't happen in the first place. But the Baal Shem Tov, one of his students came to tell him that in Vilna they said about him that he doesn't have a portion in the world to come. And the Baal Shem Tov started singing and dancing, and he was so happy. They asked him, why are you so happy? This is a terrible thing for someone to say about you. He said, my whole life I wanted to fulfill this Mishnah. My whole life I wanted to serve HaKadosh Baruch Hu for no reward. Now that I know that I'm not going to go to the next world, now I'm finally serving HaKadosh Baruch Hu without a reward. The same thing they tell by the Lithuanians, though the Gaon of Vilna doesn't seem to be dancing so much in the story. Rather, the story is the Gaon of Vilna needs a lulav and etog, and he's unable to find that lulav and etog, and finally they manage in a strange sale to get him a lulav and etog on condition that the Gaon of Vilna won't get any of the mitzvot, but he'll transfer the mitzvot to the person who sold the lulav and etog. And the students were very worried, maybe he wouldn't agree. They finally agreed to the conditions, brought the lulav and etog to their rabbi, and the Vilna Gaon was so happy. He said his whole life he was waiting to do a mitzvah and not receive any reward for it. And now he's finally able to fulfill a mitzvah and not get any reward for it. It's an unusual teaching because it's very difficult to justify this teaching in any of the texts of the Torah. Look throughout the Torah. Hashem says, "Im b'chukotay telechu." If you follow in my way, X, Y, Z will happen to you. V'im lav chas v'lam, and if you don't, A, B, C is going to happen. Malachi, the prophet, tests the Jewish people and tells them, I want you to see, offer your things to HaKadosh Baruch Hu, and let's see who HaKadosh Baruch Hu doesn't reward. Meaning he's sure that HaKadosh Baruch Hu is going to reward people. It's a very unusual teaching for someone who believes in the Torah to tell the Jewish people to serve HaKadosh Baruch Hu without any type of reward, because the Torah is full of conversations surrounding rewards. And then that qualifying statement at the end. So what Alina says, at first glance, you would say, he's asking you to love HaKadosh Baruch Hu so much that you serve HaKadosh Baruch Hu out of love. But then, as the Rabbanit points out, at the end there's it's a twist. Vayhi mora shamayim alechem, and the fear of heaven should be on you. The awe of heaven should be on you. What kind of name is Antignos for a good Jewish boy? What?
He's a convert. He's a convert.
Most likely he's not a convert.
Yeah?
Antignos is born in the Am Yisrael. Where does he get the name Antignos? Look, Shimon HaTzadik, Moshe, Yehoshua. Why Antignos? What kind of name is Antignos?
Probably Roman.
At this period of time, we're not dealing with the Romans.
Greek?
The Greeks, it's a Greek name. It's a Greek name. How does the Chacham and the Jewish people get a Greek name? By the way, there's this whole mess about people. This is inspired by a certain group that I mentioned earlier, but I'm not going to say directly. About which name of a person do you pray for? You want to mention somebody by the Torah, you want to give them an aliyah, tell me your Hebrew name so I can call you up to the Torah. What does it mean, a Hebrew name? I have a Hebrew name, so I'm not here to offend anybody. But what does it mean, a Hebrew name? A Jewish person has to have a Hebrew name. Does a Jewish person have to have a Hebrew name?
I thought that was one of our merits, that we kept
He
Hebrew
did,
name.
yeah, correct.
Antignos ish socho. He didn't have a Hebrew name. By the way, when you pray for somebody, you're supposed to mention their name?
To have him in mind, yes.
Are you supposed to mention the name of somebody when you pray for them? Let's clear up Jewish myths once and for all.
Yes.
Where? Where do you find such a thing in the Torah? Tell me in the Torah an episode in which somebody prays for somebody else to have a refuah shlema.
No, just find Miriam. It says, I'm not a fan.
Oh, very good. Moshe Rabbeinu prays for Miriam, and he just says, Hashem, heal her. Hashem, heal her. From here, our rabbis learn, though those of you who are familiar with the teaching, that you don't have to mention somebody's name. Rather,
Have it in mind.
you just have to pray for a person, even if you don't know their name, you pray for them. HaKadosh Baruch Hu already knows who to pray for. So people say, I can't pray for somebody, you don't have the Hebrew name. Hashem won't answer the prayer. You think HaKadosh Baruch Hu doesn't know what it says in your driver's license? Your name is, I don't know, whatever name it is, Stephen or I don't know, give it a George or whatever. HaKadosh Baruch Hu doesn't know who you are. Well, suddenly HaKadosh Baruch Hu doesn't know anything anymore. There are stories about Hasidic Rebbes, they send back papers. I'm sorry, I can't pray for that name. That's not your mother's right name. What kind of Jewish name is Mary for? Mary is a Persian Jewish name, just for the record. Mehri. It's a name. It has an H in it, so you pronounce it if you don't have a good Farsi pronunciation. But how dare you tell somebody it's not a Jewish name when Jewish people have this name? And there's even, if you want to go into the realm of Kabbalah, according to Kabbalah, which I'm not a Kabbalist, but let's just throw it in there for everybody who insists on Jewish names and Hebrew names and praying for people with their names. According to Kabbalah, if you pray for somebody with their name in front of them, you might actually damage them. You heard what I'm telling you now? There's the Khatam Sofer like that, the Zohar like that. The reason why people have problems in the first place, according to the Mekubalim, may have something to do with the name they have. That's why when people get very sick, they change their name, correct? Why? Because their name has something to do with whatever's going on in their life, according to this group of teachings. So actually, when you pray for somebody, you shouldn't mention their name at all. I'm sure they didn't teach us that in Hebrew school, when they told us about the importance of having Hebrew names. And who told you about having the importance of Hebrew name? Rabbi Mendel, Rabbi Klonimus, Rebbetzin Sprinza. Who told you have to have a Hebrew name? All of those names are not Jewish. They're not Hebrew. For sure they're not Hebrew. Jewish maybe. And anybody else who would name their child Sprinza if they didn't hate them.
When in Mitzrayim, they were saved because they keep their name, their language, and their way of dressing. So that name has to do something with a Jew.
What about Antignos? I mean, is he guilty? Is he guilty of not having a Hebrew name?
He's an exception, maybe? Aren't there exceptions from the norm? Or particular
Can't we
circumstances
introduce
like
names?
Moshe?
Hold on, wait, Mord, you just brought us something even better. How many of the names in the Tanakh are repetitious, as opposed to they're being invented by the parents as the child is being born? So is it really a Jewish name in the beginning?
We make them Jewish.
We make them Jewish. Yafeh Mod. Very good. Rabotai, you have the answer that you need right now. I just ask that when it comes to persecuting people for their names,
Is Greek an exception, though?
if anything,
Greek, we're allowed to write a Sefer Torah in Greek, correct? So maybe Greek is an exception to that.
if anything, Greek should be worse, because Greek is a rabbis say you can't even study Greek. Of all the wisdoms, the Greek wisdom you can't study. Let's
Rabbi, we find the name Alexander, and he is.
have Alexander in the shiur right now. Alexander is a Jewish name. You know how many Chachamim were named Alexander?
I'm saying, so we had some Greek names.
So that's what I'm telling you. Antignos Ishsocho, most likely Antignos' parents were part of the Jews that were assimilating into Greek culture. How do you get a name like Antignos? Here, one of our greatest Chachamim is born into a family that probably today couldn't get their kids into yeshiva. And he's the only link in the chain to give us our Torah. So we needed Antignos Ishtocho. And he never felt at any point in his rabbinic career that he had to sign up for a Hebrew name. Just for the record. So what is Antignos dealing with? He's dealing with his own family, his own community, his own world. The Jewish world is affected by Greek values. And if there's one value that is directly opposed to the value which Antignos is teaching in this Mishnah, it's what it's found in Kehillat and Yeshayahu, and not in a positive sense, by the way. By the way, I wrote here Elohim with a hey, so I ask that you keep this paper safe, because this one cannot unfortunately go to the trash or anything like that. It was a mistake. V'shibachti ani et hasimcha asher en tov le'adam tachat hashemesh. Says Kehillat. Says Kehillat, I therefore praised enjoyment. For the only good a man can have under the sun, kim le'echol v'lishtot v'lismoach, is to eat and to drink and to be happy. V'hu yilvenu ba'amalo yemei chayav asher natanu Elohim tachat hashemesh, and this will accompany him throughout the days of life that Hashem has given him on earth. Yeshayahu also mentions the terrible things will happen to the Jewish people for following this mentality. In source 3. V'ines hason v'simcha harog bakar v'shachot tzon achol basar v'shatot yain achol v'shato ki machar namut. Eat and drink, for tomorrow we die. Now if you Google that sentence, eat and drink, for tomorrow we die, there's a famous Greek philosopher that pops up. Anybody know his name? Epicurus. You've heard of him before? You ever heard of the word epikuros in Hebrew?
Yes.
They call him an epicurus, yeah? What is this word, epicurus, epikuros? This man, this was essentially his philosophy. If you wanted to boil it down into eat and drink and be merry. And I know that I'm oversimplifying a complicated person. I'm just saying that this philosophy of eat and drink for...
An understanding of this philosophy.
Alexander Menashe, I accept that. I accept, by the way, that I'm oversimplifying this philosophy. And you should know that when looking for this quote in the writings of Epicurus, you won't find it. Because it's not ever said that way, at least not intended to be said that way, but that's definitely how people have walked away. They call it the Epicurean motto. If I'm not mistaken, this is what they'll refer to it in the modern world. Antignos Ishtocho is dealing with a world that says, eat and drink because there's no reward, there is no tomorrow, there is no olam haba, there is no reward and consequence, there is no reason for you to do mitzvot. It's all a farce. You're going to wake up one day and you'll just be dead, and then you'll say there's nothing happening after life. So why did you spend so much time not eating your favorite fruit? Why do you spend so much time learning Torah? Why do you spend so much time doing mitzvot? There's no reason for it. Why does Antignos Ish Socho deal with this? Because unfortunately, this philosophy plagues his own Bet Midrash. Look with me in source 4, in Avot de Rabbi Natan. Avot de Rabbi Natan is a book that very similarly represents Pirkei Avot and its style and content. The first part is very similar to Pirkei Avot. Antignos Ish Socho kibel mishimon HaTzadik. Antignos, the man of Socho, received from his rabbi Shimon HaTzadik. This is source 4. Hu haya omer, he used to say, Al tiyu ka'avadim ha'mishamshim et harav al manat lekabel peras, ele yu ka'avadim ha'mishamshim et harav shelo al manat lekabel peras. That you should be like servants who serve their master not to receive a reward. Vi mora shamayim alechem. And the fear of heaven should be on you. And then it continues, one sentence we don't have in Pirkei Avot. Kedei sheyeh secharchem kaful la'atid avo, so you should receive a double compensation in the future, a double reward in the future. And then, Avot de Rabbi Natan continues to tell us the next story. Look at the top left on page 1. Antignos isocho hayolu shne talmidim. Antignos had 2 students. Shayu shonin bidvarav. That they would study his words, meaning they were very meticulously analyzing his teachings. V'hayu shonim letalmidim, and they would teach those words to the other students. V'talmidim letalmidehem, and those students would teach that to the next group of students. So these were very close disciples of Antignos Ish Socho. That they were teaching the other students, and those students would teach to the next level of students. Amdu v'digdeku acharehen. They analyzed this sentence of Antignos Ish Socho very closely, and they reached the following conclusion. V'amru, and they said, Ma ra'u avotenu lomar davar zeh. Why did our forefathers, meaning Antignos Ish Socho, why did he say such a thing? Efshar sheyaseh po'el melacha kol hayom v'lo yitol secharo arvit? Could it be that a worker is going to work the whole day and he's not going to ask for his compensation at the end of his work? Ela ilu hayu yodin avotenu sheyesh olam acher. Rather, if our forefathers would have known, if they were aware that there was another world, v'yesh tchiyat hametim, and they would have believed that there was revival of the dead, resurrection of the dead, lo hayu omrim kach, they would never say such a thing. Meaning, why did our forefathers tell us to serve Hashem as if you don't receive a reward? It's unjust. Why should I serve HaKadosh Baruch Hu not to receive a reward? By the way, you should know, I belong to a number of different groups of rabbis. One of the groups of rabbis I belong to is a wonderful interdenominational group of rabbis and people in different places in the world. And in the early parts of the pandemic, there were a number of rabbis who told their communities that, struggling communities, where they're not going to accept salaries because it's not fair to put the community through trying times. And this rabbi, I was very impressed with him. He told his community he's not going to take a salary for the duration of the pandemic because it's not fair that an already struggling community that doesn't meet regularly, it's not fair that he should take money from them. And I was like, wow, that's an impressive rabbi. Until I read the flip side of the story, and that was he told his community that because he's no longer accepting a salary, listen carefully, it's immoral for him to teach them Torah classes, and it's immoral for him to officiate at their life cycle ceremonies because it's immoral for a person to work for no compensation. Now, I guess in some way that makes sense. If you got a job somewhere, you'd ask for someone to pay you for it. I remember reading this article, and I was like, wow, look, it's a rabbi who doesn't take money from people. Wow. And then I saw the flip side. Well, it doesn't take money, it doesn't help anybody either. What kind of rabbi is that? I couldn't believe it. So is it moral for a person to work and not ask for compensation afterwards? Rather, it must be that our forefathers knew there is no next world, there is no resurrection of the dead, and because of that they told us what they told us. Amdu pirshu min Torah, they stood up and separated themselves from the Torah. V'nifretzu mehem shte pirtzot, and out of them came 2 breaches in the wall of Israel. Tzedukim uvaitusim, the tzedukim and the baitusim. I think in English they call baitusim both the sin. I don't know how to pronounce this word. Maybe you know how to say it better than me. Look it up in your encyclopedia. Tzedukim al shum tzadok, baitusin al shum baitus. there were two houses of Kohanim that were students of Antignos Isocho. One name was Tzadok. Tzadok was a Kohen Gadol, and Baitus was also a Kohen. And these two groups came forth from those respective individuals, and that's why they're called Tzedukim and Baitusin. By the way, the Tzedukim deny this story happening exactly the way it happens, but for our intents and purposes, we're understanding Antignos Isocho in his rabbinic teachings. This is the understanding of Chachamim of what happened here. And they would use silver and gold utensils their whole life, meaning they would indulge in this world. They never felt bad about this. They were arrogant people. And the Tzedukim would mock the Pharisees, and they would say, oh, the Pharisees have a tradition that they suffer in this world, and they're only going to be surprised in the next world. These Pharisees who have all these rules, they're going to wake up in the next world. They didn't eat, they didn't drink, they didn't indulge, they weren't merry. They're going to wake up in the next world and realize there is no next world. And the Tzedukim would mock Chachmei Israel. But where did the Tzedukim come from, according to our rabbis? Who takes the blame for creating the Tzedukim? Our rabbis. Our rabbis take the blame. Antignos creates Tzedukim and Baitusim. Now the Baitusim, by the way, are an interesting group if you want to research them. Our rabbis refer to Tzedukim and Baitusim almost synonymously. Now, they may or may not be the same groups. As I mentioned to you earlier, we don't have independent writings from either of those groups. But these different groups of people are very similar, maybe with one difference, and that is the Tzedukim were known to be very arrogant, ruling class type Kohanim, and the Baitusim had a little more of a knack for people. They were closer to the people. They were a little more community-oriented, less indulgent, perhaps, than the Tzedukim. But again, those are all theories. Our rabbis use these things interchangeably. Our rabbis see the Tzedukim as a little more militant than the Baitusim, who are just non-rabbinic, but not necessarily as militant as the Tzedukim are. Both of them create problems for the rabbis. And essentially, the main part of where this shows up is when it comes to announcing the new month of the new Rosh Chodesh, and the Tzedukim start to pay people to go give false testimony in the rabbinic courts, and this creates a whole disaster, and that sets the precedent for rabbinic courts only accepting testimony from people that they consider to fit into a certain criteria of ne'emanim, people that we trust. Until then, every Jewish person came to give testimony was testimony. Now there's a very strict criteria. Who do we accept in a bedin to give testimony over what? So I would say that if you zoom out for a moment and you look at these Tzedukim and Baitusim, there's a danger. There's a danger in the world of Torah that is full of love. By the way, here I'm sure that some of the Bible-thumping preachers in the world, and the Jewish world, would be very happy to hear what I have to say. The danger of love of Hashem is that if I love Hashem and I'm close to Hashem and everything is good with Hashem, then, who cares about mitzvot so much? There's a certain closeness to HaKadosh Baruch Hu when, HaKadosh Baruch Hu is my father, HaKadosh Baruch Hu is my parent, HaKadosh Baruch Hu loves me, HaKadosh Baruch Hu loves me, then he doesn't really care that I keep Shabbat or I eat kosher. I just saw today an ad, a targeted ad on Facebook. It said, you eat bacon? Don't worry, God has better things to worry about. Join us for our Passover Seder. And it was some fascinating ad of, God doesn't care that you eat bacon. No, if God didn't care, he wouldn't tell you not to eat bacon. Nonetheless, there is a certain mentality that is born out of over love of Hashem. You love HaKadosh Baruch Hu too much, and that leads to a certain rifuf, I don't know a word in English, a certain lack of care, of particularity in mitzvot. And so what does Antignos Ish Socho write at the end of his teaching? At the end of his teaching, he adds one sentence, Vayhi mora HaShamayim alechem, that there should always be fear of heaven on you. Don't get so close to HaKadosh Baruch Hu, and you see this in any way of your life. It's parents with children, it's students and teachers, it's managers and employees, or whatever context it is. There's a very fine balance between keeping a distance and creating a certain type of awe, while not being too aloof and removed that people don't trust you. But also there's a danger of a person in a leadership position getting a little too close and a little too frivolous in front of people and then ultimately losing a level of authority. And Antignos is warning those who serve HaKadosh Baruch Hu out of love. You just love Hashem, that's why you serve Him, right? You're not doing it for a reward, you're not doing it for a mitzvah. The flip side is Vehi Mora Shamayim Alechem, that you must have awe of heaven. You must. Why? Because if you don't, you won't fulfill any of the mitzvot. And essentially the Pirushim are reacting. Who are they reacting to? The Pirushim are reacting to the Tzedukim, to the Yisims, to everything else that's going on. And the Pirushim create a new faith. And this new faith incorporates a tremendous amount in the Jewish community. We say, does she have Yirat Shamayim? Do people have the awe of heaven? Why do we ask that? When we ask that question, what do we really mean? Are they observant of Torah mitzvot? Do they have Yirat Shamayim? And this gives birth to God-fearing Jews. And God-fearing Jews are exactly the problem that we're dealing with today in our generation. It's exactly what the Pirushim were dealing with back then. If you look with me at source 2, page 2, source 5. The Gemara in Masechet Sotah writes, Tanu Rabbanan, our rabbis say. So, the Mishnah mentions there's certain type of Pirushim, certain types of Pharisees. This last Parush is one who says, tell me what I need to do, and I'll do it. Says the Gemara, what's wrong with that? What's wrong with a Jewish person saying, tell me what the mitzvot are, I want to fulfill the mitzvot? What's wrong with that? Rather, says the Gemara, this is someone who says, tell me what further obligations are required upon me, and I'll perform them. This is a person who's always looking for more mitzvot, and more mitzvot, and more mitzvot, which the Gemara seems to consider a negative character trait. The Baraita then adds the righteous due to love, the righteous due to fear. I didn't want to focus on these Pirushim today. I want to focus today, now, on this last part of our shiur, on the commentary of Rabbi Binyamin Lau, on these 7 types of Pirushim. And I want you to think through with me all the different types of Orthodox Jews you have in the world today. The Pirushim. By the way, I'm not here to hate on the Orthodox. All the Jews in the world have this problem, but certain groups more than others. The Talmud describes several different types of obsessive religious behaviors. This is page 3, source 6. We are all too familiar with these kind of Pharisees in our everyday religious experience. The Shechmi Pharisee, the one who acts in the manner of Shechem. Remember, what does that mean? That is the person whose actions are motivated entirely by his own benefit, such as the circumcision of the men of Shechem. Tell me that story. What happens? What's the story with the men of Shechem?
Where Shimon and Levi killed all the men in Shechem.
Very good.
After they captured Dinah.
So they captured Dinah, they raped Dinah. Shimon and Levi come to kill the city of Shechem, but how do they get them to be weak in the first place?
They asked them to circumcise.
Very good. They ask all the men to do a brit milah, to circumcise themselves, and they come in on the weakest day and they wipe them out. My father-in-law, he once told me from one Hasidic Rebbe whose name I don't remember, why does Shimon and Levi bother circumcising all the men before they killed them? And he said the answer is quite simple. He said the way that anti-Semitism works is if they were going to kill a whole bunch of rapists who were non-Jews, the world would scream. Oh, human rights violations, all kinds of things. But now that they made them all Jewish and they converted them to Judaism with the Brit Milah, now nobody cares if you massacre the whole city of Shechem afterwards. There's hardly need to even mention this type, because all of his acts are purely for his own sake and not for the sake of heaven. They did a Brit Milah because they wanted to marry into the Jewish people. He may fulfill commandments with the very best Pharisees, but his motivations are entirely self-centered without any trace of godliness. How many Jewish people? They purport to be observant of Torah mitzvot, but the underlying motivation for their Torah mitzvot is to show off, is to be part of a certain Jewish community. It's a certain elitist attitude that they have over other Jewish people that are around them. Shechmi, you're not fulfilling mitzvot because of HaKadosh Baruch Hu. You're fulfilling mitzvot because of yourself. You're fulfilling mitzvot to make yourself look good. By the way, this happens all the time. Chumot. People have all kinds of stringencies they take on themselves for a different topic, a different class, and a different time. Why do you know about the chumrot that people have in their personal life? Why do you know about them? How did you come to discover someone else's chumrah? They're telling you about it. That's right. Why are you telling me? If it's not required, and it's extra, and you do it because you're such a God-fearing person, so just keep it to yourself. Why do I have to know about it? The only reason you tell me is to show off. You're serving yourself. You're not serving anybody else. Don't fool us into thinking that you're somehow more observant or more. You're just a person who likes to show off. The Nikfi Pharisee. Nikfi Pharisee?
If I'm not mistaken, Rabbi Vadia and Moshe Feinstein Pascal, that it's asur to perform a chumrah barabim.
Very good. But this is a klal all across the board in halakha. But yes, performing a chumrah in public, which is what you mentioned, has along with it the danger of essentially saying that everybody else is doing something wrong. It's motzi laz. You're telling that all the chachamim that came before you, they didn't know what they were doing. Things that were good for all of Am Yisrael are no longer good for you. It's dangerous in the sense that you think you're so great at the cost of someone else. So for example, someone says, in our house, we want to have 3 sinks, one for meat and one for milk and one for power. And they come to my house, they see that I have 2 sinks in my house. But not because of me. I don't use my sinks are both besari and chalavi together. Why do I have 2? Because the Jewish people who lived before me in this house, they put in 2 sinks. So they used to say meat and dairy. I just took off the stickers that say meat and dairy, and today it's 2 sinks that are multi-purpose. But now you come to my house and you don't want to eat my food. Why? Because the rabbi doesn't have 2 sinks. So is that a chumrah? Or are you now in a situation where your chumrah is how you throw people out of the Jewish nation? Your child says, I can't play with you because my mommy said that you do X, Y. Well, then that's not a chumrah anymore. The fact that you're doing this chumrah publicly, that we even know about it, you're the problem. And that's right. Benji, you're correct. This is the reason why we don't do chumrot in public, among other things.
Moshe actually writes in his teshuvot, when he writes teshuvah, that he's against blended whiskey for various reasons. But he also writes he's very makbid that when he's at simcha, he always has a cup of blended whiskey.
You don't have such rabbis anymore. So I have in my book, I have a story about Rabbi Yosef Chaim Sonnenfeld. Alav Shalom. By the way, my wife's grandmother was raised by Rabbi Yosef Chaim Sonnenfeld. She was an orphan and he took her in. He was a chief rabbi of the Charedim in Yerushalayim. Essentially, he came to a wedding, a Sephardic wedding, and there was some kind of meat. I don't recall what the deal was. It could have been that it was from the backside of the animal, where they did niku. And they saw Rabbi Yosef Chaim Sonnenfeld eating the meat. And one of the rabbis in Yerushalayim said, Rabbi, this is the meat, you can't eat it. He says, I'm at a Sephardic wedding, which Sephardic Talmidei Chachamim are present, and they're eating this meat. How dare I sit here and not eat the meat as well? I mean, what? I don't eat it in my own house, that's fine, but here, how am I going to pretend it's not kosher? You don't have people like this, and people with this kind of straightforward mind, you don't have them in the world anymore. That's Ali. The Nikfi Pharisee. So who's the Nikfi? He's the guy who walks into things and blood sprays everywhere. One who knocks his feet on the ground. Why? This is the person who walks heel after toe. That should say heel as an H-E-E-L. I was typing fast. Who avoids lifting his foot for fear of not finding where to tread. And so he drags one foot after the other, running his feet and going nowhere. This is a foot dragging, this is not the blood Pharisee. This is the Pharisee who's dragging his feet. This is a foot dragging religiosity based on fear, which brings a person and those around him to spiritual paralysis. Remember those words. Spiritual paralysis. Any innovation, any untrodden territory seems to him to be an impassable minefield. This kind of fear paralyzes. This is the Jew who's afraid of doing anything new, anything they didn't hear about before, anything that they don't want to be exposed. They're afraid. They're afraid of taking one foot forward because it's uncharted territories. My rabbi didn't tell me. My mother didn't tell me. Whoever it is that didn't tell me. They're stuck. They're frozen. And the problem is they're not frozen. They freeze everybody around them. You don't want to be from those who lead Am Yisrael to the future. That's fine. But stop getting, there's a saying, my sister-in-law has a saying on her fridge. It says, those who say it cannot be done should get out of the way of those who are doing it. This is the same thing. These Pharisees that are getting in the way because they're afraid of the future. This is the Kizai Pharisee. One whose blood spurts out on the walls. That's a pretty graphic image. What's his story? he averts his eyes from seeing evil. When he thinks he might see a woman in the street, he closes his eyes so that he bumps into walls, injuring his head. I don't know about you, but I don't live anywhere where we have this type of Pharisee, but I don't know how the United Kingdom looks, but in Israel, those of you now joining the Shur from Israel, you are full of such Pharisees that exist in the world. Every time they walk like that, because they can't see, they walk at the wall and their blood spurts everywhere. The description of the bleeding wound here is significant. In his attempt to avoid what he sees as a sin, this person is capable of shedding his own blood. Again, it's a typo. Such a Jew ends up bruised and wounded, and his fearful approach is condemned. So ultimately what happens is, in your search for piety, righteousness, you harm yourself. This type of piety, this type of righteousness that was self-harming is dangerous. It's dangerous. And it's condemned by Chachmei Israel. Now you should know, this is a classic case of the one who doesn't want to look at a woman. But here there's other issues. Today, in the world of halakha, my wife is in the field of mental health. In the realm of halakha today, there are new conversations being had about the place and the role. Anyone here in the mental health world? Anybody in the shiur? No? My wife stepped out. Oh, very good. Okay, so there's new conversations being had. There are new conversations being had about mental health and halakha. So for example, teshuvot about OCD, obsessive compulsive disorder, and how that can translate into issues with people being overly particular in halakha, not out of a genuine religiosity, but at a very dangerous mental issue that they're struggling with already. And sometimes systems of halakha can be very dangerous for a person who's struggling with OCD. How suicide is treated in halakha, those attitudes have changed over time, maybe slowly, but are being changed. Other issues, I'm not talking about stigmas and stereotypes, I'm talking about taking into account that negative side effects can happen from a religious experience. And those are to be condemned. And this type of Pharisee is being condemned because the type of Torah he's bringing to the world is one that is self-harming. This is the pestle Pharisee. One whose head is bent in humility when he walks. This is the person whose sense of fear makes him want to simply disappear. I have a dear friend who every time he talks to me, he apologizes about something. Always apologizing. But recently I spoke with him, he didn't have what to apologize for. He was trying to think what he could apologize for. I told him, I said, you don't have to apologize for existing. First time you did nothing wrong ever, but you exist and you should exist and you should be here. Here's a person, the sheer weight of his overwhelming fear of heaven crushes any possible expression of his own personality. This kind of Pharisee reflects the type of excessive humility which leads to total self-negation. If I may, and I'm here speaking not politically correct, if I may, that this type of Pharisee is very often found in the world of Baalei Teshuvah, those who are new to the religious experience. And the guilt, by the way, is not on them. The guilt is on those who teach them. It's a certain, you don't know anything. You might be 30, you might be 40, you might be 60, however old you are. You're now learning for the first time how to tie your shoes according to halakha. You don't even know how to go to the bathroom correctly. We have halachot about that. You should live in self-doubt your whole life. And that creates for a certain personality that is, especially one that is intimidated by this type of teaching or this type of life, it creates for a very unhealthy experience in which I just wish I wasn't here because I know that I can't follow halakha properly. Everything I do, I think I'm doing something wrong. This is a terrible religious experience to go through. And there are people that teach people like this, that they are responsible for teaching Torah this way, incorrectly. And if a person is ever experiencing this on their own personal religious experience, I ask that you reach out to somebody who's competent, who knows halakha well, who understands you well, and can say, listen, slow down, calm down, everything's good. HaKadosh Baruch Hu loves you. You're not messing up. Everything is fine. Let's go back and start over again. My wife, a number of years ago, had to do a refresher course on Taharat HaMishpacha. Because we found out that in the places in which we were, that Taharat HaMishpacha, family purity, was being taught in such a terrible, oppressive way, and I have no other words to use aside from those, that people's relationships were being harmed every single day because of the way in which these halachot were incorrectly taught to them. By the way, and you talk to some of the teachers of these halachot and you wonder, they don't know anything either. So whoever taught the teacher doesn't know anything. And it ruins people's marriages. It ruins relationships with their families. It ruins all kinds of things. Sometimes you just have to stop and, hey, whatever I did, if this is what it's bringing me to, if I become a pestle Pharisee, I'm the problem. I need to stop and fix it. What else should I do, and I will do it? This is you ever heard of the Chumrah of the Month Club? These are those who always like to add new stringencies. Every time I saw once last year, one of the rabbis, someone who I respect, someone asked him a question on halakha about Pesach. He said, there's a Chumrah, a new stringency going around. He said, I'm so happy when they come up with new stringencies. I get bored of the old ones from last year. I want some new ones. People make up new mitzvot all the time. You want to see new mitzvot? I'm not speaking to denigrate any Talmid Chacham. The laws of Lashon Hara in the Rambam. Anybody know how many halachot are in the Rambam's laws of Lashon Hara? How complicated is the topic of Lashon Hara?
Very.
The Rambam has 8 halachot. I think it's 8. So it's 8 sentences which summarize all the laws of Lashon Hara. Harav Peretz, by the way, claims it's a little too long. He has 5 sentences which summarize all the halachot of Lashon Hara. And then, alav shalom, a blessed memory, you see the Chavetz Chaim. Volumes and volumes and volumes and volumes of Lashon Hara. And you wonder to yourself, how does that happen? How does it happen that in the Shulchan Aruch, Maran has barely a chapter talking about the laws of Asher Yatzar, the blessing that you say after you go to the restroom? And when I was in Israel a few years back, I showed my wife in the bookstore 3-volume books, not little books, thick books, 3 volumes, Hilchot Asher Yatzar. How complicated is it in the restroom that you don't know the bracha, what has to happen exactly for you to need to say this bracha properly? Hilchot Ketubot, the laws of contract. I got a special ordination, Hilchot Ketubot. How much taste? Shulchan Aruch, Rambam, Talmud. I saw a series, I think my mom wanted to buy me a set of books. My mom learned a long time ago that that's the only thing I need is gifts and books. It's an 8-volume set of books on the laws of Ketubot. It's a waste of paper. It's a waste of ink. It's a waste of shelf space. 8 volumes on Ketubot. How could it be? So here we have an entire group of Jews. One who is obsessed with fear, constantly looking for more strictures to obey. He can never relax because he's convinced that there must always be some additional obligation, some new stricture, some new task. There must be something more he can do to improve his worship. He wants to achieve religious perfection, but only feels a sense of his own imperfection. This kind of obsession can create tremendous tension and social pressure. When my wife and I got married, we had some interesting conversations. Interesting conversations because the way in which my wife was raised and the way that I was raised, and more correctly, the way in which I was educated after being raised, they don't always line up with each other. One great example, Pesach. I'm not talking about here kosher without symbols and labels. I'm not talking about any of that. How long does it take for a person to make their house kasher lePesach? How long should it take a person? I guess it depends how large your house is, right? But how long? What?
A few hours.
A few hours. A few hours. You want to be strict? Take a day. I'm inventing something? Chachmei Israel instituted that you should search your house for chametz how many weeks before Pesach? The night before Pesach. Very good, Betsy, that's correct. The night before Pesach, you're supposed to search your house for Pesach. By the way, for those people who've cleaned their house already from Purim, so Purim time, you don't clean your house anymore. There's no more chametz in your house. It's done. You're done. By the time Pesach rolls around, all that's in the refrigerator is potatoes and eggs and carrots. That's all that's left in the refrigerator. So what's in the night before Pesach? What do you do when you make a bracha? I am coming to check my house for Pesach, for chametz, and you know there's no chametz in your house. You're making a bracha levatala. You're saying God's name in vain. Because there's no chametz here. There's no chametz to be found. So what do people do? They take all kinds of little, bread crumbs and they scatter them all around the house and they play a game. It's a hide and go seek. They know where they put them and they go search for them. And it's a nice game, but it doesn't fulfill any kind of halakha. You make a blessing on that. You're guilty of saying Hashem's name in vain. It's one of the 10 commandments. You live in a world where people can never just say, wow, I'm done. This is before Pesach, I'm done. I have nothing more to do, everything is okay. Let me just sit back and relax. Erev Pesach, and let me go to the beach, and let me go out, whatever you want to do. Go have a good time. How much do you have to prepare ready for Shabbat? All the rules and all that. People have lists, checklists of things they have to do before Shabbat starts. And then all of Friday becomes a nightmare for children, for spouses. Everyone stays out of each other's way because anybody is a ticking time bomb that might explode at them right before Shabbat. You live in a Jewish world where people can never just do enough. It's never enough. Always needs to be something bigger, something better, something stricter. And this kind of obsession can create tremendous tension and social pressure. Summarizes Rabbi Ben Ilau, the common factor in all of these is a nervous, neurotic kind of religiosity, grounded in the basest type of fear, and which fails to help a person attain any spiritual elevation at all. This, I think, is the best sentence that was out of this whole packet. A neurotic kind of religiosity, which fails to help a person attain any spiritual elevation at all. There are some people who are incorrect. They're misguided. And they think that the reason why we do what we do at Shiviti is to make everything easier for everybody, to make life simple, because we don't care about mitzvot, because we don't care about Torah, because we don't care about this or the next thing. The exact opposite is true. If we could free the Jewish people from the halachic neurosis which they suffer from, if we could free the Jewish community from doing all kinds of things they're not obligated in, and to channel that energy to things that are important, that are valuable, that do lead a person on higher spiritual paths. If before Pesach, instead of being on your knees, like someone that I'm related to, and scratching in between the floor tiles with a toothbrush to get out any morsel of chametz in the, I don't know what you call that stuff between the tiles. There's a word for it, with a G. Grout, thank you very much. You know, they say that when I moved to Israel, they said, it's not that you're going to learn more Hebrew, you're just going to forget your English. That's all the time. Imagine, I never recover from that. So the grout, scrubbing the grout. What could be in the grout? So what happens? It comes time for the Pesach Seder. And I can't sit anymore, my back hurts, my knees hurt, I'm so tired, let's rush, I want to go to sleep, all these guests are coming. Your Pesach Seder, it's your highest night of the year. Leil HaSeder, Leil Shimurim Hu. It's the most precious night of the calendar, the HaKadosh Baruch Hu. And what happens? Most Jews are too tired. They're too worn out to even experience the Seder Pesach. In my community, a long time ago, I pushed, and Baruch Hashem, you should know, the ladies in my community are tzaddikot. Every one of them better than the next. I said, it doesn't make sense that you're going to work hard for weeks and weeks and weeks. It comes time for the most important tefillah, the nighttime of Pesach. We say Hallel in the Beit Knesset. And where are you? You're busy cutting up karpas and putting out salt water or whatever else you're doing at your house. For who? For all those guests that are coming to your house. They don't pay your bills. They don't help you clean your house. They don't do anything. Why don't you come to the Beit Knesset and pray like a human being? You're also Jewish, no? And in my Kehillat, on the nights of Chagim, the nights of Shabbatot, Baruch Hashem, men and women are here. Everybody's praying because your guests are not good enough for you to lose out on your spiritual experience. So we're making it easy for people? Yeah, maybe. We're freeing up people's lives to allow them to indulge in the real parts of Avodat Hashem, in the real parts of service of the Creator, of HaKadosh Baruch Hu. And I think that this shift has to happen. The Tziddukim have given birth to the opposite. If they didn't care about mitzvot at all, they gave birth to a type of Judaism that cares about mitzvot too much. What do you mean too much? It's a dangerous thing to say. You have a Talmud, you have a Rambam, you have a Shulchan Aruch. Why do you keep looking for new halachot? Why do we need them? The Shulchan Aruch is not good enough for us? We're not able to just do Pesach the way it was, to do Purim the way it was supposed to be, the way Shavuot and Sukkot the way it was supposed to be, Shabbat the way it was supposed to be, Kashrut the way it was supposed to be, Tarat HaMishpacha the way it was supposed to be. We're so obsessed with making our lives difficult, all in the name of HaKadosh Baruch Hu. So then our children hate HaKadosh Baruch Hu, our wives hate HaKadosh Baruch Hu, our husbands hate HaKadosh Baruch Hu, our communities hate HaKadosh Baruch Hu, and then we spend millions of dollars. It's like a vicious cycle. We spend millions of dollars on outreach organizations and seminaries and yeshivot, because the whole generation of Jews who hate God, we send them back to those same people who made the first generation, and they educate them all over again to do all the same mistakes all over again. So the next generation will hate HaKadosh Baruch Hu, and the community will hate HaKadosh Baruch Hu, and the children hate HaKadosh Baruch Hu, and then it's a vicious cycle over and over and over and over again. And when is someone just going to say, stop, stop? We're pushim. Yeah, we're separated from the world. We have our own Torah, our own mitzvot, but there's a limit. HaKadosh Baruch Hu has told you exactly what you need to know to live a happy and content life. And if I may end with the teaching of Rabbi Yehuda Levi. Rabbi Yehuda Levi was asked once by the king of Khuzar in this famous conversation in the book of the Kuzari about why a person like him tries so hard to fulfill mitzvot. And he said, the only freedom I ask for in my life, enani mevakesh kim hashibud, achirut, the only freedom I ask for is freedom from the slavery of society. He said, because HaKadosh Baruch Hu gave me 613 commandments. I know exactly what HaKadosh Baruch Hu wants me to do on Shabbat. I know exactly what He wants me to do on Sunday, on Monday, on Tuesday, on Wednesday. I know exactly how HaKadosh Baruch Hu wants me to treat my children and my spouse and my parents. I know everything. I know exactly how to make HaKadosh Baruch Hu happy. When it comes to society, when it comes to people, when it comes to the Jewish community, says Rabbi Yehuda Levi, it never ends. It's a bottomless pit. You will never make them happy. No matter what you do, they won't be happy with you. He says, the only freedom I ask for is the freedom from the servitude to society. Let me just serve HaKadosh Baruch Hu. Because HaKadosh Baruch Hu is honest with me. I know exactly what I need to do, exactly what I cannot do. And that type of freedom is the most freeing spiritual experience a person can have. HaShamayim alechem. This is a double-edged coin. To love HaKadosh Baruch Hu, to fear HaKadosh Baruch Hu. Those two things balance each other out. And the number one thing that a Jewish person needs in their life, any person needs in their life, is balance. But especially when it comes to something as dangerous as spirituality, as religion, which can very quickly become imbalanced, very quickly, to one direction or the other. The person must always go back to a place of balance, to find that middle ground. B'ezrat Hashem, next week we'll continue on the list for B'Shem Tov Gagin's Shiur. But for today, I just want to thank you for your time, for being here, for learning with me. Tiskul mitzvot B'ezrat Hashem, and God willing, I will stick around for anybody who has any questions or comments or anything else they wish to discuss after the Shiur today.